Hey everyone, it's Todd Stone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Science of Business podcast. Today we'll be doing part 1 of a 2-part series on the generational workforce. Scott and I will be discussing this paper right here, titled Generational Differences at Work, a Meta-Analysis and Qualitative Investigation by Ravid Costanza and Romero, was published in 2024 in the Journal of Organizational Behavior. Unlike the last episode, this paper is unfortunately behind a paywall, although when I went looking, it wasn't that much if you decided you wanted to purchase it and review it yourself. You can find it by simply Googling this actual title, and it comes up in one of the first searches once you Google it. During this conversation, we're going to be discussing this latest research around the generational workforce, and I personally found it challenging to some of the existing assumptions I had as somebody with a lot of experience leading people and now in the coaching and consulting world. So I think you'll find it interesting, challenging. Hopefully it will expand the boundaries of the way you think about this particular issue. So I hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, here we go. All right. Well, Scott, here we are, episode 2 of the Science of Business podcast. And today, like we mentioned in the intro, we're going to be discussing this 2024 paper around generational differences. And as part of a 2-part series, we're going to be kind of looking at this paper, which did kind of blow my mind. I got to be honest. I think I even kind of remember you kind of smirking when I wanted to talk about this. You were already aware of the research, and it was really interesting. So let's just start. Why don't you set it up? Tell us the paper we're going to be talking about on generational difference today.
Yeah, good stuff. So I actually first was introduced to generational research when I was at Miami of Ohio. My mentor and colleague at Miami of Ohio was Dr. Megan Gerhardt, and she wrote the book Gintelligence, and she is the author of this anchor article for this series of leveraging generational differences in the HBR Big Idea Collection. And I did a few projects with her, and we were doing social science research on generational differences, and it was fascinating when I actually started to lift up the hood to try and understand what are generational differences. Is there anything real there? What are all the assumptions? What are the best practices for leveraging them? And I think it is very nuanced, and it is one of those topics that not enough people are paying attention to, because we talk about diversity across a variety of different demographic characteristics, but age and difference is in generation, not so much, or at least definitely not nearly as much as all the others. And then when this meta-analysis came out, I think you pronounced the first author's name Ravid. So when Ravid et al. Came out, it was probably the best, most recent meta-analysis, which is basically a study of studies that is your best bet at looking at a phenomenon from an empirical lens, taking a step back and looking at all the research to say, what's the effect, or is there an effect at all, and in what direction? And so it's been fascinating to kind of intersect those two ideas, the meta-analysis showing what happens empirically with all the big ideas of generational differences from these scholarly practitioners, I'll say.
Yeah, so I think, well, first you referenced Megan Gerhardt and the cohort of people that wrote the HBR article, which we're going to talk about next in our next episode. These are two opposite perspectives. One, which we're going to talk about here, but I'm going to kind of spoil it. One is this research paper, which I would say, because I've now read not as many research papers as you, but dozens.
Sure.
It takes a fairly strong position, the kind of conclusion you normally see in like physics or something else. This was like, hey, generational differences are not real, which is, that's kind of the lead of this. And then you said, I think people aren't paying attention enough to this. I would actually say they're paying the wrong attention, So they actually are, because I wanted to explore this topic because we hear it from our clients all the time, directly and indirectly. Oh, I'm really struggling with, now it's Gen Z. I remember back when it was millennial. They don't want to work as hard. And so I was really curious. I think what's really interesting is that the authors of the study aren't saying there isn't something there, but they're saying the framing, this idea of generational archetypes, maybe we could call it, buckets, patterns, that there's no good evidence that those exist. But then interestingly, they did something else. They, just like me, said, we acknowledge that people are fascinated by this topic and they talk about it all the time, including researchers, even though the data seems to say there's nothing there. So we want to figure out, why do we keep promoting this idea? And what are their thoughts about this? So I think it's controversial. It's interesting. Definitely challenged me. So before we kind of jump into it, any additional framing up of at least today's paper?
Yeah. One thing to frame up is specifically what they are evaluating when they're breaking it down by generations, but what is the it? They're looking at the most popular, what I would call dependent variables within organizational behavior, the outcomes. So things like job satisfaction, organizational commitment, work engagement, work-family balance, on and on and on. Those are typically looked at as attitudes or behaviors, which end up being kind of the downstream end of some type of model. What I think most people are talking about when they're talking about generational differences is they assume that they have different characteristics. Like in your example, one's lazier, one generation is lazier than the next. And there's not really a ton of great research on that aspect, on those front end individual characteristics, but there's a lot of great research more so on those end of model attitudes and behaviors that are very popular within organizational behavior that arguably should be all you're really needing to care about, because those are when the rubber hits the road: commitment, performance, etc. So that's one potential frame up. And then I also think there's a specific reason why it still becomes this recurring theme of interest. In a way, what a lot of the research is illustrating, in this meta-analysis comments on this, it's almost impossible to figure out with 100% certainty just by the nature of the categorization. So generational categories arguably are hard to pin down. So for example, I'm 1982, so I'm a very, very young millennial, and I'm almost a Gen X. So which characteristics do I really have when I'm on the fence? I mean, and literally some generational categorizations would call me one versus the other. So to use this cohort effect tends to be a little too rough, because then you have what are called age effects, which are correlated with generations. And then you also have what would be like episode effects, where you're part of a certain experience because of the year that you were born.
COVID, 9/11, the great financial crisis, right?
That's right. So is there really an elegant way to separate those three effects: generational differences, episodes, and age? Not really. And so we do our best using empirical means, but I think that's why it keeps coming up, and that why it still becomes a theme that no research is capable yet, doesn't have the data set yet to really figure out how to do that well.
Let's, kind of some of the same questions I started with last week. Why this paper? What is it trying to do? What is it not trying to do?
So why this paper? I chose this paper because it was a meta-analysis, and what a meta-analysis is, in its simplest terms, it's a study of studies. So, research and quoting research and citing research is great, but it really is just one sample. It might be a sample of 300 full-time employees in the United States in a specific industry at a specific point in time. The study was done in 2025. If you really think about it, to base all of your determinations off of that one study is limited. It's a great data point, and it's a usable data point, and everything that is in these published studies is certainly reliable and valid and is real, but it's really just one sample.
Right.
And so you can look at the effect sizes and the relationships between variables in that one study. But if you have overlapping variables, so generation is a variable that is studied in all sorts of different articles. And then you also have work engagement, for example, also studied in a variety of different articles. Why not take all of those one individual studies and then put them together and do a meta study or a meta-analysis where there are specific empirical means and calculations to control for some of the differences between each one of those individual studies, so that you can take a step back and say, is this average effect size statistically significant within a certain range? So for example, are millennials more motivated than Gen Z, more or less motivated than Gen Z? So you can literally compare what are the differences between these two, considering the fact that they were all different samples of different sample sizes and different variability, and actually come up with a number that is sound. And so that's why I chose a meta-analysis, because it is, in a way, the best approach to saying what is real and what's not empirically because of its broad nature. But also this is a good article because then they take all of the conclusions of these articles and they do a qualitative thematic investigation of the types of recommendations they're making. So they use two different methods. So that's why I chose the article. And I forgot what the other question was. I was so excited about why it's a good article.
What is it trying to do? What is it not trying to do?
I think it's trying to determine whether the traditional, most popular outcomes of organizational behavior, which typically are in categories of attitudes and work behaviors. So like job satisfaction is an attitude, job performance is a behavior, and trying to see, is there differences when comparing two generations at a time? So generation A and generation B, is there a difference in that work engagement? Same thing over and over for each one of those variables, and then across all of the different combinations of generations. What it's not trying to do is make any claims that are some type of hypothesis about a specific direction, like this generation is probably going to have this generation is probably going to have that. It lets the data do the talking, and it's actually way less interested in kind of the theoretical rationale as to why one might be higher or lower than the other.
Yeah, so I think the other interesting thing that stands out to me is they did that meta-analysis, right, of 143 independent studies, independent samples, and 158,000 plus individuals.
Right.
As you said, a lot of the research papers we read, in fact, the one we covered last week might have had 40, 50 participants. They maybe have 100 or 200. This is a consolidation of everything they can find. They did try and do something like this 10 or 15 years ago, and there wasn't enough data. There was some, but it feels like there's been a rise in this generational. It's called generational theory. I didn't know there was a theory behind it, but it's called generational theory. There's been a rise in the research interest.
Yeah, that's right. And this happens quite a lot. I mean, interestingly, I would say for the biggest topics within organizational behavior, organizational psychology, you'll sometimes see one relatively well-cited meta-analysis a year. It definitely every 5 or 10 years. I would say there's probably 5 to 10 decent meta-analyses out there just on generational differences. Some of the time, the reason that they're out there is because they're studying relatively different things. So for example, one meta-analysis might only focus on work engagement and job engagement and work values. And then the next one focuses on a different set of dependent variables. So it is a value add for them to go and do that additional work on some new sliver. Sometimes people will redo it because something big has happened and a trend might be happening that didn't happen before.
Yep.
So for example, you might do a pre-post COVID evaluation, given that now everybody works from home and they didn't work from home previously. So sometimes there's a motivation for doing this big one. But yes, a lot of times also they'll build upon each other, and there's just a larger sample size because so many more studies have come out, and now there's just a more robust data set to draw from.
When they say there is, essentially they feel fairly decisive, that there's no correlation between these generational archetypes, these generational descriptors, and the real world. How do they arrive at that conclusion? What are they doing?
Yeah. Think of it as they're looking at two different variables at a time, and technically three. One of them will be focusing on a specific dependent variable at a time. So for example, stress/burnout, and that could be categorized a variety of different ways, but there's lots of articles out there that look at stress and burnout as a dependent variable. And so they're going to look at that specific dependent variable, and then they're going to evaluate, was there a difference in the effect size of generation one, whichever one you want to look at, on stress? And that might be, for example, for this generation, there is a 0.05 effect size, which is looking at if this specific generation is a yes, how much higher is that dependent variable of stress and burnout? So let's just say it's 0.5. And then you look at the next generation, generation number 2, and you show, hey, there is a 0.06 effect of that second generation. Yes or no, are they in that generation versus that outcome variable of stress? So they just found, okay, one's 0.05 and the other is 0.06. And then they would say, okay, well, that's a difference of 0.01, right? 0.06 minus 0.05. Given the amount of variability and given the sample size, is that a statistically significant difference? And so think of it as like a bell curve. Does it fall within these bounds of 96% or 0.5 or better, or 99% more sure that there really is a difference of 0.01 between those two? And so all statistics is just looking at probabilities.
Right.
And so there's a relatively high threshold in empirical research like this to say, hey, we're basically saying 99% accuracy, more or less, that we think that the effect size is within this specific range. And so when you extrapolate that out across all this data, you can feel relatively confident that if there's a small effect size, it's going to be hard to illustrate that that is real. If you see a high effect size like 0.10 or 0.20, there's going to be a higher likelihood that there must be a there to see that big of a difference within that data. And so there's like these big three that you're kind of looking at. So the higher the sample size, the more likely you're going to find statistical significance, even when it's down to a small number. The higher the effect size, so the higher the effect size, the easier it is to illustrate there's something there. And then as well, the number of people in the overall sample. So when you start to triangulate that, you get a better feel for how accurate is it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think one of the interesting nuances is they're not saying there aren't differences between someone who is a 50-year-old person at the workforce and a 25-year-old person at the workforce.
Right.
They're not saying that. And I think that's important without having thought about all this and really reflecting on it. My initial intuition is, well, I just disagree. That disagrees with my lived experience, right?
Yeah.
And I think I even said something in our last podcast about my intuition is that these formation experiences, stuff that happens affect you. And they're not saying those things don't affect an individual.
Mhm.
They're also not saying that there aren't differences between 50-year-olds and 25-year-olds.
That's right.
They're not saying there is. They're just not, they're saying that's not
Yeah,
we're not talking about age.
that's
We're
right.
talking about this idea of generational buckets. We're talking about generational stereotypes.
Yeah. And it's tricky. It's tricky, Todd, in that the two are so strongly correlated, right? The
Right.
generations, when
Right.
you go from Gen Z to traditionals, inevitably they get older.
Right.
And then if you're going to run an analysis and a regression to say, is working through the generations, which increases in age, having an influence on this dependent variable, stress, for example, or is it age? Technically, you should control for age. You want to put it into your regression model and then evaluate, is the generation deal
Right.
still
Yeah.
effective?
Basically, it wants to remove that variable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's not the variable we're testing. We're not
That's right.
testing this idea that age affects these different variables. We're talking about, does belonging to this generation
That's right.
affect these variables?
Mhm.
And that's where this gets kind of nuanced, is we run into this so often with stereotypes. I'm remembering, I believe it was a Malcolm Gladwell book where they talked about the orchestra tryouts where the person was visible
Yeah.
versus the person was behind a screen,
Mm-hmm.
and how different the raters rated the performance when they couldn't see the performer,
Yeah.
because there was this bias. They literally experienced the performer differently because of whatever bias they had
Mhm.
based on whatever visual cues they were picking up from the performer. And it could be something like race or sex, but it could also be like someone's disheveled versus
Yeah.
someone's well groomed. There
Yeah.
were all these things, and they said our intuitions, when we look at someone, inform the way we experience that person, unless we go through a process of trying to remove those biases from those evaluations.
That's right.
This feels to me like we're really in that territory when it comes to generations.
Yeah.
I think age is another thing that is connected. I'm not saying the age thing isn't also a bias, but
Mm-hmm.
like we need to separate age versus generational theory.
That's right.
I think they did look at like 6 or 8 different variables.
Yeah.
Turnover, stress. I can't remember what they all were, but they were ones that you would go, yeah, those are the kinds of things that stereotypes are built on.
Right.
Oh, they don't want to work hard. It was stuff like that.
Yeah.
Did any of the characteristics show? Were there any outliers where there was some signal around generational differences, or were they all just, there was just nothing?
Yeah. There were a few that showed a statistically significant difference. So, for example, within extrinsic versus instrumental work values, Gen X versus boomers,
So
there
that
was.
just for everyone, extrinsic is stuff like money,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's
Yeah.
money, status.
Mm-hmm.
Intrinsic is, I'm passionate about this. I have high internal motives to
Yeah.
do this, just so people understand those
Yeah.
buckets.
Yep. And there was a statistically significant effect size difference in that specific generation. And what's also interesting about it is it significantly decreases, and it's still statistically significant, but it's smaller when it takes out one study. And what's interesting about that is it's kind of highlighting that there may have been an outlier in here for some reason, because there was this one study that had this really strong effect. So when you take that out, it actually is kind of small. And so it's a really good approach, a very thoughtful approach when doing a meta-analysis to kind of test yourself and say, is this influenced by one specific instance? And so when you remove it, it's there, but it's not a huge deal. Similarly, boomers versus traditionals, they have a slight difference in a statistically significant difference in extrinsic instrumental work values. So you could look across all of these specific dependent
So
variables.
just curious about the direction of that.
Yeah.
Is it more intrinsic at the younger with the more recent generation?
The older the generation, the more instrumental as opposed to extrinsic, which, and this has actually been written about in other articles, most people would say it's really not that interesting. What's really getting at is this idea of younger generations are at the time of their life where they have to be more intrinsically oriented because they've got mouths to feed and they haven't created that nest egg yet.
Yeah.
And then the boomers and traditionals.
Me going from COO to coach, right? That's a classic. Yeah, I'm like, okay, my family's raised. I can do something now that's more
That's right.
personally fulfilling.
That's right. And so the argument is kind of like, if you could make an age-based argument for why that effect is there, is it really a generational difference?
Right. Yes.
Probably not.
Right.
And I think that happens over and over again, where when you do just so happen to see one or two differences when comparing, out of however many comparisons they're making, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or so comparisons, when you look at all the different generations to each other, to pinpoint one of those 6 and see a statistically significant difference that really could be argued by age differences, overall, you got to take a step back and say, that doesn't mean there's really good evidence of generational differences. If there was, there's no hard and fast rule for this, but if you're looking at 6 different relationships and only one of them has the effect going in an interesting direction, are you just cherry picking something or are you seeing a trend? So that's one problem. And the other problem is more this, if there's not a theoretical rationale based upon the generation, then it's not real, right? So what is the generational argument? And the generational argument really looks at like the lifespan development, like what's happened within their era. So when you were at this specific fundamental developmental age and X, Y, and Z happened to you during that era, right? Like the internet became a big thing when I was just so happened to be in college or in high school, and that like really changed my mind about everything. That's a generational theoretical argument.
Right.
And if you can explain it because of that and somehow tease that out with more specific mechanisms or mediators or whatever, then you got something to be excited about.
Well, I think one of the things that makes science is predictive capacity, right? So one of the things that we want to be able to do, and behavioral science is, humans are complicated. We're not as easy to map as particles. But one of the observations in this study is that the predictions that researchers want to make aren't rooted in the data. What's happening there? But I'm curious from your reading that part 2 of this, like, why are we continuing for this to be a thing? Why are we continuing to feed the beast, even though all the data suggests that this framing is wrong? What does it say? Does it have any clear opinions? I didn't get the impression that it had real clear opinions on that.
I agree. I think it was more cautioning against it. I didn't see any clear recommendations on how to stop the phenomenon. And in a way, there's people that will perpetuate a philosophy or an idea without evidence simply based upon intuition and a gut feeling. That's always going to be a thing. And to some degree, I think it's easy to categorize. And we, as human beings, have this social shortcut of simplifying the people we work with and the environments we're in. And when you have this really clear, regularly discussed schema of how to judge people and how to talk about people, you can't help but buy into that language. And it's simpler, it's easier, it's a shortcut. And in a way, your mind is amazing, but it also is very lazy. And that's just to some degree why biases happen at large, in that we're trying to make shortcuts and cut and slice people into specific personas. We do it as a business practice for efficiency, but our mind also does it for the sake of its own evolutionary nature. And when you have all these things in the environment, talking about it, perpetuating it, and to some degree, it's kind of fun to talk about. You know, it
Right.
almost creates this easy
Yeah.
social banter. It's kind of inevitable that it is one of those things that keeps getting discussed and used when making determinations. It's those that are really, really thoughtful about making sure they don't accidentally use it in a way that is hurtful, or in a way that perpetuates something that's, out of the ordinary. And I think that's why it happens. And there's that happens in all different shades of biases, but in a way, this one also feels safe. We're not talking about race. We're
Right.
not talking about gender. We're just talking about age. We're
Right.
all going to go through
Not
these
even
age
age, because I
periods. Or,
think,
excuse me. Yeah, it's
yeah, I
true.
think if we were talking about age, it would be more some of the taboos that we have as a culture. We've recognized, oh, this bias thing.
Mm-hmm.
First we kind of realized that around sexism, then racism. Those are real clear boundaries. But when does a child become an adult? Like what, it's not like in one moment. And so with age, we understand how age discrimination, it's easier for us to intuit,
Yeah.
make that connection. Oh, I can see how age discrimination could follow some of these other things.
Right.
Generational buckets to me is much more like sports teams. Grew up in Wisconsin, Packer fan. I live in Kansas City. Kansas City is a big sports town. You live in
Yeah.
Cincinnati. Cincinnati's a big
Mm-hmm.
sports town. You
Yep.
take a lot of pride. You assume the identity of your franchise.
Yeah.
And
Identity.
yeah, so I think that
Yeah.
there's something subtle around generations that sort of let us sneak in that bias that we would be more aware of if we were just purely talking about age.
Yeah.
Um, Thoughts?
I agree. And I do like the terminology of the social identity being a part of this. I mean, you always kind of harken back to like, hey, I grew up in the 80s, or I
Right.
grew up in the 70s, or I grew up during the era of this or that. And to some degree, we want to be a part of it. And when we want to be a part of our social identity or the socially constructed identity, it almost gives us this feeling that it's acceptable to put other people into the
Right.
same social identities based upon their age, even though they might not necessarily feel that sense of identification there. Um, yeah, and that's interesting because I am on the border of two. So I've never actually had this sense of identity of, I'm straight up X or I'm straight
Right.
up millennial. It's never really resonated with me because I don't
Right.
feel like I really identify with one camp or the other. If I read the descriptions of the things that they've both been a part of, I'm like, well, I was kind of part of that and kind of part of this.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a social construction.
Yeah. So I think that one of the interesting, I'm going to see if I can find this quote because I think it's worth reading here. It says, from a practical standpoint, our qualitative analysis, along with the work of Costanza et al. 2020 and Salvi et al. 2022, raise questions about why managers, organizations, and the population at large continue to focus on, emphasize, and claim the need to better understand a phenomenon that does not exist. Practitioners should be quite concerned with the number and breadth of studies that offer practice recommendations based on small or non existent findings. Our meta analytic and qualitative analysis findings support the argument against generations. So, what I hear them saying is we don't know what to do about this. We're saying as emphatically as possible,
Yeah.
this isn't a thing. There's another quote, I'm going to try and find it here in a second, where they're actually saying it's not just not a thing, it's also bad. It's bad because of it, like all stereotypes, it overgeneralizes, it mislabels, it I think they gave an illustration where they talked about the fact that it creates self-fulfilling prophecies, which is a super interesting
Mm.
facet of this.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it was saying if I, as a manager, think Gen Z are less ambitious and less motivated, then
Yeah.
I subconsciously take resources. I'm not as vested in them.
Mm-hmm.
And when they feel that, then they in turn behave in the way that I predicted they would behave.
Yeah.
So that is a fascinating, what's the word? It's a critique. So it's not just saying this is unproductive or we're wasting money. No, what they're actually saying is that because we believe it, the construct becomes real in our minds. Because the
Mm-hmm.
construct becomes real in our minds, we then behave in a way that actually causes us to manifest this, thereby reinforcing our initial opinions.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah.
I'm curious about your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it is. Well, for one, it is a very like specific, dramatic close to this empirical
Yes.
article, which I do think to some degree scientists in this domain get a kick out of the competition of it's real, no, it's not, it's
Yeah.
real, no, it's not. And it's sexy. And sometimes it sells publications or at least gets them accepted.
Yeah.
And I think that there's always nuance to it. And in this specific article, it might not be real, but it's not real for a specific set of variables. And
Right.
sometimes they don't constantly add those, references or
Right.
caveats or asterisks. And I do think, though, that they are right on to push practitioners in general to focus on evidence-based management. Like, why do we make decisions or take actions without knowing that there is evidence behind it? This is kind of a little bit different angle. This is saying we need to be cautious of what we're doing because not paying attention to it is perpetuating something we're spending a lot of time on that's unnecessary. And I think also that it's one of those things that we're never going to know with 100% certainty until we have centuries upon centuries upon centuries of data where you can compare
Right.
somebody in the age range of 65 to 75 back in the 50s and then in the 2000s and then in the 2050s, on and on and on.
Right.
And so they're cautioning that it's not ready for prime time. And then I do think that is important to pass on to employers. It's just one more example of cognitive biases gone wrong. And I was in a meeting recently and was talking to a C-level leader in a board meeting and constantly making the complain about those darn millennials.
Right.
And I had to kind of grit my teeth a little bit through it because what I think he was really doing was making this argument of, young early talent isn't engaging in X, Y, and Z.
Right.
But I would venture to guess when he was in the work environment around that age range, there may have been similar comments being made by, the people that were 40 years his senior as well. And it is perpetuating the wrong language, which is those darn millennials. That's not the case. It's more so you see an issue with younger talent that you need to figure out what to do with that. Do you need to work with it? Do you just need to ignore it? Like make a business decision on how you're going to adjust to it without making the labels, because that perpetuates, biases.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I do think what it's not addressing at all, and it doesn't attempt to, and I do think some of what we're going to talk about in the next paper we talk about in our next episode is this very real aspect of how you change as you age.
Uh-huh.
And I would also say as you accumulate experiences,
Hmm.
we also understand there's effects of aging cognitively,
Yep.
and there's trade-offs. There's all these different aspects. But I am curious, it doesn't talk about age-related differences, but is there research on age-related differences that isn't generational, but I think most people can say, well, definitely got to be a difference between a 55-year-old and a 25-year-old.
Yeah.
That feels like that I would be really startled if there aren't some
Yeah.
um associative
Hmm.
differences in work styles, leadership styles, whatever. So I'm just curious, is there that out there that can sort of balance this out, that if I want looking for
Yes.
something that's research validated and that's more, is
Right.
there research out there on that side of the fence?
Absolutely. Yes. There is good research that looks at the impact of age on a variety of different things. What's called lifespan development or lifespan development theory is recognizing that there tends to be this like three stages
Mhm.
where your early career stage is primarily about learning, developing experiences, accumulating new knowledge, new network. Um, and then you get to a point where you really are just trying to exploit as much of that learning and network and everything else as you possibly can. Those
Right.
mid-level years tend to be where your revenue potential and your potential
Yeah.
for promotions and
Leverage. You're
highly leveraged.
leveraging. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. That mid part of your career is so important for doing just that. And then you eventually get to the third stage of your career, which does tend to be more, how do I coach and give
Yeah. More
back?
actualized.
More
Yeah.
actualization. Absolutely. So there is good research that shows kind of the differences across, I would call it, you could call it age, you could call it work tenure, you could call it a
Right.
variety of different things.
Yeah.
But I do see that affect a lot in research when you start looking at different ages or age bands. Sometimes it's very simple where it's like young on average versus old on
Right.
average, which is even very simplified
Right.
there, right? So where do
Yep.
you create the cutoff? But I do think that a lot of studies will illustrate differences in leadership style, career management approach, leveraging relationships versus leveraging their expertise. Like you see all of those across age ranges.
Yeah. So I think that my big takeaway from this research is that there are real cultural aspects of what we might call generations. We kind of listen to the same music, da 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 da. I think a good thing, if we think about ethnicity, right? We think about like it's bad and unproductive and inaccurate to make labels around ethnic groups from a work performance standpoint. But
Right.
we can also celebrate cuisine, culture, this experiential side of that
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
is relevant, right? That's distinctive to that culture, that environment, but we're not carrying it over here into the work world, where really what we're most interested in is sort of its performance. We're in the game of business. What we're
Mm-hmm.
looking for is, does this tell us anything about how this person's going to perform organizationally, their capacity to lead, do, manage, achieve any of this stuff. And that's where it's saying there isn't anything there. It doesn't mean we have to like abandon our funny TikTok videos about Gen X, right? Like that's fine. That's an interesting kind of fun thing. But I think when you go to prescribing it to work, that's where it feels
Yeah.
we're really at risk when we don't draw that distinction. Do
Yeah.
you, is there anything about that framing that you like, dislike, agree with, disagree with, or do you have a different frame for it?
No, I 100% agree. I think that is the right framing, and that's the right advice. Nothing to add to it. There's a few things I'd recommend from this article is to be careful when you are yourself making generational categorizations, and or caution others when you see them making generational categorizations. And a add-on to that, simply recognizing that in many cases it might just be age differences, and recognizing those age differences, and also again being cautious of potential biases, whether it's age or generation. And then I think another big picture here that hopefully we'll get across through all the series of podcasts is that things are always a little bit more nuanced than what they seem.
Yeah.
And in this case, we are helping reveal why it's complicated and what are those nuances and how to understand a really popular phenomenon, generational differences at work, from a layer of specificity that allows you to speak up as a leader and help navigate the conversations towards something that is more accurate and that is grounded in evidence as well as logic. I think just knowing these concepts and being able to sort through what's real versus what's assumed makes you the wise person in the room, especially when it has implications on how we're judging others.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add to that is that it's not a neutral, that because of the way bias works, to me, the self-fulfilling prophecy thing really, I guess that for me as a coach,
Yeah.
and thinking about some of the conversations I've had, and let's face it, I was a manager and a leader long before I was a coach.
Mm.
I do think that this, you said our brains are lazy. Another word, lazy, another word for lazy is efficient. So our brains are efficient at 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 this sorting and categorization thing because it simplifies the world for us. It lets us navigate complicated situations quickly,
Mm-hmm.
which one of the things when I'm thinking about the difference between a useful a useful sorting methodology and a potentially dangerous bias is what are the impacts if I'm wrong? Like what are the impacts if I'm wrong? And
Mm.
so of course, growing up in Wisconsin, my rubric is it's best to be a Packer fan, right? But the impacts, if I'm wrong, are they're trivial, right? It doesn't matter. We're just rooting for a sports team. So those like that kind of thing, it's fine. It's fun. It's comfortable. It feels natural. Oh, you're a Vikings fan. You're a Bears fan. Woe to you, whatever it is. But the whole point is that our primitive brains don't really differentiate between a sports, just our natural, uh, the way we naturally sort into in group, out group around sports or around something like generations, where it actually could be, um, it could be unproductive. It could actually affect your bottom line. It could affect the resilience of your team. It could affect your very capacity to solve a real problem. Let's say that you're struggling, right, to recruit and retain young people. In the worst case, you justify it under some kind of a generational pretext, and you don't really do the hard work of business, which is we got to solve this problem, and we got to have the right rubric, the right framework for solving this problem. What if it's individual? What if it is true for young people at this moment? What are the pressures they're dealing with, and how can we be more responsive as an organization? So I do think that it's not I think I came into this thinking that, okay, well, maybe if it's not real, what's the harm? Almost really. That's probably where I was coming. What's the harm? It's good fun. It's good fun I come out of this going, oh, it could actually be very harmful.
Yeah.
That was my that was my takeaway. And I think to your point, the other is that because we're commingling generational differences, which aren't real in this way, they're not real in this way, with real differences that are related to age or this career, this life trajectory or career trajectory research that is real and is valid, that there's enough there that it will be a hard bias to address sort of head on,
Yeah.
just to come right after it, which that I wanted to mention it because I think it sets us up really well to talk about what we're going to talk about next time, which is, okay, let's imagine that we're not going to change people's thinking around this by just showing them the data. Like there's deep intuitions, there's deep biases there. Like you said, you're in a room with someone on the C-suite. Are you really going to get into this? Well, technically, da da da. It's not it's often a difficult conversation to have when this idea is so rooted already into the way we think about different age phases. So how can we sort of uh, hijack the generational differences bias that's existing and redirect it to
Yeah.
something that is actually research based, actually grounded,
Right.
actually produces tangible business results? And so that's what we're going to talk next time about. And I think it's a really, really fascinating way to pivot. And I think there are actually some disagreements between what we're going to talk about. I think they would have some, I don't know, at least one of the authors,
Yeah.
but I get the impression there are some actual sticking points. There are some
Yeah. Oh yeah.
things that they actually would say, no, we think the paper we talked about today has it wrong, which I think is
Yeah.
also interesting. So
Yeah.
is there anything else you want to do to set up next week's conversation relative to this one?
Yeah. It's interesting. We just spent, all this time together talking about why it's not there. And now we're going to tell you a few things that are actually there
Yeah.
in the next episode, because there are some elements that I think are useful, that you can leverage generational differences for where there really is something there. So yes, I think that'll be fun to go through and explain the right way to think about generational differences and how to leverage them, regardless of whether they have differences in job satisfaction or job performance across time. I think it'll be a practical conversation.
Excellent. Well, last week we did a little section on interesting questions, and I haven't thought of one, but I can think of one, I'm sure. So just as a pivot before we wrap up, interesting question you've had recently. Anything come to mind?
An interesting question that I've had recently has been around how do you manage the tension? I've seen this several times in different organizations, so it's a fresh topic for me. How do you manage the tension between the local unit, the local business unit entity that you're
Mm,
working for, and making sure there's enough autonomy and empowerment and the ability to be innovative when you are embedded within a larger organization that has most of the authority, power, decision-making control on what your unit can do. And so this idea of like the local versus international,
right.
or the unit versus the meta unit. I have had 3 different leaders that are dealing with a similar problem in managing this tension appropriately. And it just feels like a problem that is really tricky to navigate and is never going away, because there will always be superstructures and then entities that are kind of cobbled together in different ways that do different things. But But for whatever reason, that's been the big question for us recently.
All right. So instead of me coming up with my own question, which I'll make sure next time,
Sure.
I actually have an interesting observation around
Okay.
your question.
Yeah.
So I'm taking a cohort of executives through Peter Drucker's ancient book
Yeah.
on the effective executive. And actually, because it is so old, it's I got some pushback from people because
Hmm.
it only uses he and him all throughout the book.
Yeah.
It was written, I think the book came out in 67 is when I think the book came out.
Yeah.
And a lot of the examples are really dated, right? So what I've done is I've said, hey, I'm not going to ask you to read the book, but the principles, we're going to use it as our spine as we go through this, because
Yeah.
he's got such good, he's a king of one-liners for business. I
Yeah.
just think he has some of the best quotes out there. But the reason I'm talking about it for this question is actually we just did the chapter on first things first. That's one of his chapters in the effective executive.
Hmm.
And one of the illustrations that he talked about was this this problem, this discovery that I think he was using GM, the 1930s GM, General Motors. And the problem that was at the top of their thing is how do we integrate new acquisitions with these very independent leaders with they've built their own brand, their own identity into the GM umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we manage this tension between GM's organizational requirements and demands and the need to have these strong, independent, opinionated leaders on our team. And so I just think it's fascinating because that's a story coming out of the 30s and 40s and 50s. And here we are almost 100 years later.
Yeah.
It's still a thing. And I
Still a
agree
thing.
with you. This is maybe one of the most persistent challenges that a fast growing organization, especially one that's using acquisitions, has to wrestle through because they know they want to innovate. They know that some of these leaders could really and the teams, not just the leader, but the teams could help
Yeah.
bring kind of novel, innovative approaches, but then they come in and they disrupt things and they create all this friction. And so, yeah, it's an interesting question. Maybe my frustrating thing is we don't really have a good answer for them, do we, Scott? It's not like it's not a simple question to answer, I guess is my point.
It's definitely not. I feel like where it is right now is there's good research illustrating best practices on the pros and cons of different approaches. So like you
Brilliant.
could have an approach that is like completely top down and the units need to do whatever the superstructure says. Pros and cons there. On the other end of the extreme, there's pros and cons of just let those independent units do whatever they want. And then there's a hybrid approach that many people kind of attempt to settle on, but it's really tough
Yeah,
to
that's what
maintain.
yeah, I think one of the things that again, I'm not saying Drucker is the be all and end all, but he does think fairly clearly. His position is not making a decision as a decision, and that his position is that you should pick, you should choose what you're going to do, and then build your, then to your point, his point is there's the responsibility of an effective executive is to make a decision. You might be wrong, but you have to make a decision because not making a decision is sort of leaving the organization in this,
Ambiguous.
they don't have real clarity and they
Yeah.
don't know which way to go. And And so I like the fact that there's sort of, I think the hybrid in anything is often the most difficult path to follow.
Yeah.
Often because there's cultural aspects that you could make the hybrid case in the ideal world where everyone has the right balance of um, independence and interdependence. But we
Yeah.
just know that ideal composition isn't distributed equally, and that oftentimes when you try and split the middle road, you kind of get the worst of both worlds, not the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd be curious. It's maybe a topic for another time, but I think
Yeah.
that's good. That's a very interesting question, and I think people that are going through that, at least what we could do is point them to the research, which I love.
Yeah.
So, all
Let's
right,
do it.
I think that's we've got enough for today. Any final thoughts?
Keep asking good questions. I think that's the key.
Well, I don't really that I can't argue with that. Yeah, that's probably I would say keep asking good questions and keep looking for answers in the right places would be my way to
Yeah,
end that. Yeah,
it's a good
because
add-on. It's a good add-on for what I think we're trying to do.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, that wraps up episode number 2. We'll catch you next time when we close the loop on generational differences. Bye. All right.